It all began on a crisp, deceptively tranquil morning in the Icelandic countryside, where the snow-covered black sand beaches stretched like ancient whispers beneath a sky painted with soft streaks of pale orange and violet, and the air was so still it seemed to be holding its breath in anticipation of something monumental, though no one could have predicted just how surreal the day would become. Imran Khan, the former cricketer turned statesman, now silver-haired and contemplative with a quiet fire in his eyes, stood beside Priyanka Chopra, whose effortless poise masked the whirlwind of nerves and conviction storming inside her chest, both dressed not in any garish ceremonial attire but in sleek, modern, minimalistic wedding garb, his tailored dark overcoat with a high collar trimmed in emerald stitching, her satin ivory gown swaying like mist around her as geothermal steam hissed softly from the earth beneath their feet, a surreal altar carved into volcanic stone behind them, and a modest gathering of hand-picked individuals bearing silent witness to the unprecedented union. The ceremony itself was swift, intimate, and stunningly surreal, performed in hushed Icelandic by a local mystic priest known only as Alvis, a wiry man with wind-worn features and an unsettling knack for appearing exactly where he was least expected, and when the final syllables of the ritual fell into the cold air, the wind picked up suddenly like a herald of fate, and something shifted, not just in the atmosphere, but in the eyes of everyone present, especially two figures in the background, one being Asher Khan, Imran's fiercely loyal but endlessly skeptical personal advisor who had warned against this union for weeks, now pacing just outside the ceremony's radius like a caged wolf, and the other, Meera Das, Priyanka's longtime friend and occasional fixer, sharp-witted and sharper-tongued, who had orchestrated the Icelandic elopement under a thick veil of secrecy and now clutched her phone in white-knuckled hands as urgent diplomatic messages began flooding in, because in New Delhi, the news had somehow leaked despite encrypted channels and burner phones, and officials were scrambling to understand how one of India's most beloved icons had secretly wed a man viewed by many in government as a controversial figure, while in Islamabad, silence hung heavy in foreign ministry corridors as speculation turned into fury, betrayal, and theories of political manipulation or madness. And none of that had even reached the couple yet, who stood at the edge of the world with vows still echoing between them, their fingers intertwined and their eyes locked in a look that asked, "What have we done? And are we ready for what's coming?" Because while the ceremony had been a whisper, the fallout was about to become a roar, and both Imran and Priyanka felt it in their bones, that electric buzz of knowing they had crossed an invisible line, lit a match in a room full of fuel, and dared the world to watch what would burn first, all while the northern lights flickered to life overhead, beautiful and ominous, as if the sky itself was opening a curtain for the first act of something utterly extraordinary. As the realization of their actions began to settle into the quiet corners of their minds, a strange sense of urgency filled the space between Priyanka and Imran, both of them quietly wrestling with the overwhelming consequences of their secret union, and though neither of them spoke a word about it, they both knew they were teetering on the edge of something bigger than themselves, something that no amount of control or fame could shield them from now. The initial disbelief that had gripped them like a frozen vice began to melt away, replaced by the stark reality of what they had set in motion. There was no going back now, no undoing what they had done, and the weight of the political storm gathering on the horizon pressed in from every side. Imran stood at the window of their tiny, rented cabin, staring into the unbroken horizon of snow and ice, his brow furrowed as the first call came through, an official from Islamabad, the voice on the other end cold and accusatory, asking what on earth had possessed him to make such a public decision without consulting anyone, without thinking of the diplomatic ramifications, and as he hung up, Priyanka could see the muscles in his jaw tighten, the gravity of his position as a former prime minister and revered politician sinking in, while her own phone vibrated relentlessly on the table in front of her, messages from Bollywood powerhouses, concerned colleagues, and countless international media outlets demanding interviews, explanations, and above all, a statement. Their lives, once marked by calculated steps, now seemed to spin in all directions, a dizzying rush of choices they had not planned for. Priyanka tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat, the swirling confusion making her feel almost disembodied as she grappled. with the unspoken conflict growing between them. This was her personal life, her choice, yet it had become something far larger, a spectacle that threatened to consume everything she had worked for. As the minutes bled into hours, they were confronted not just by the phone calls and mounting political fallout, but by deeper questions about themselves. Who were they in this new, unforeseen world, where their every move could either bring nations together or tear them apart? It was a terrifying truth, but one they had to face, and so, as the night settled in, they decided to venture beyond their isolation, stepping out into the biting cold of Iceland to find clarity, to understand what was really happening beneath the headlines. They crossed paths with Alvis once more, the Icelandic mystic priest who had married them, and his cryptic words earlier, "You've triggered a storm, but it will lead to a path you must walk," began to resonate in Priyanka's mind, making her feel as though there was something much deeper at play than simple political maneuvering. The encounter, however, quickly spiraled into an unnerving experience, as Alvis warned them that their marriage had inadvertently created an ancient and unforeseen political ripple that no one could control. The secrecy, the surprise, the suddenness of it all, everything felt orchestrated by forces neither of them fully understood, and now, they were caught in a web they couldn't untangle. Meanwhile, the outside world was catching wind of their elopement with dizzying speed. News outlets, political leaders, and rival powerhouses began scrambling to piece together the implications, some attempting to exploit the situation for their own agendas, while others moved to discredit their union entirely. It wasn't long before they received word of a new player in the game, an enigmatic figure known only as Zain, a high-ranking international diplomat who had worked with both the Indian and Pakistani governments in the past, and whose arrival in Iceland was both a blessing and a curse. Zain was an ally, someone who had once worked closely with Imran, but his arrival brought with it a clear message. The marriage had set into motion not only a diplomatic crisis but a potential threat to the fragile peace between India and Pakistan. The whispers grew louder and the obstacles became more intense. There were political backchannels they could no longer avoid, dangerous conversations they couldn't unhear, and emotional barriers that neither of them had anticipated. Priyanka's fear began to mingle with her anger, her frustration at being reduced to a political pawn in a game she had never intended to play, while Imran wrestled with his responsibility to his country, his legacy, and the woman he had secretly chosen as his partner, knowing that they were facing not just a personal reckoning but a greater historical moment that neither could control. Every step they took felt like a misstep, every conversation felt loaded with consequences, and with each passing hour, they realized that the world outside was pulling them in 1,000 directions at once, forcing them to make impossible choices that neither of them had the clarity to make just yet. As the night drew in, the reality of their precarious position became overwhelmingly clear to both Priyanka and Imran, who now stood on the precipice of a confrontation that could shatter not only their personal lives but the very fabric of geopolitical relations they had unknowingly set into motion. Everything, every whispered conversation, every hurried decision, every fractured alliance, had led them to this moment, and there was no turning back now. The tension in the air was palpable, charged with the weight of consequences that neither of them had ever expected to bear. Priyanka, her face pale and her eyes clouded with the uncertainty of their future, paced the small cabin as she mentally catalogued their dwindling options, the whispers of public outrage and diplomatic threats echoing in her mind. She had always thrived under pressure, had always known how to navigate the glitz and glamour of her world, but now, standing at the crossroads of international politics and personal love, the stakes were higher than she could have imagined. Imran, too, had been shaken, his calm demeanor a thin veneer over the storm churning beneath, his years of experience in both politics and cricket no longer offering the clarity they once did, now feeling like relics of a time before the game had changed. As the night grew colder, their conversation turned more serious, more urgent, no longer about the ceremony or their feelings, but about survival, about the truth they needed to face head-on. They knew their enemies had already mobilized, from the shadowy figure of Zain, whose diplomatic maneuvers threatened to trap them between two warring factions, to the political hawks who smelled scandal in the air and were ready to use it to ignite long-held grudges. The greatest threat, however, was the force that had been growing beneath the surface all along, the very media frenzy they had tried so hard to control. In a world where perception was as powerful as truth, the narrative was already being shaped. Two public figures, one from a divided region, the other a symbol of Bollywood's global influence, had secretly wed, and the consequences were impossible to ignore. Imran and Priyanka both knew they had only one shot to neutralize the growing storm, and in that silence before the storm broke, they gathered their resources, the weight of their choices pressing down on them like a vice. They had no choice but to lean on each other. Imran's deep understanding of the political landscape and Priyanka's global influence and media savvy were their only real weapons in this high-stakes battle. They would need to confront their enemies directly, not just in the political arena, but in the court of public opinion as well, and in doing so, the very foundation of their relationship would be tested. Could they use their shared story to turn the tide in their favor, transforming public outrage into empathy, or would the forces that sought to tear them apart win? With everything on the line, Priyanka made the final decision. They would not hide. They would face the media head-on, taking control of the narrative before their enemies could spin it into something unrecognizable. They would make their stand together as a united front, publicly confronting the accusations and pledging to continue fighting for peace between their respective nations. It was a risky move, but the only one that might work. The time for secrets was over. As they prepared for the inevitable press conference, the weight of the world seemed to press on their shoulders, yet there was a quiet strength in their unity, in their willingness to face whatever came next, together. The final confrontation would come, and it would be ruthless, but they were ready to stand tall and confront the chaos that had been unleashed by their love. The world would never be the same after this, and neither would they. The day of reckoning arrived with the brutal force of a storm, as Priyanka and Imran stood before the waiting press, the air thick with anticipation, tension, and the weight of a world watching. The cameras were flashing, the microphones sharp, and the questions came like daggers, relentless, accusing, probing for the truth behind their secret union. Every word, every glance, felt like a moment of life or death, for both their careers and the fragile peace they had unintentionally threatened. What began as a love story, a simple union between two souls, had exploded into a political wildfire that stretched across continents, and now, standing at the epicenter of it all, they had no choice but to face the consequences. The emotional toll of the moment was immense. Priyanka, normally so poised, found herself trembling beneath the surface, her heart racing as she looked at Imran, whose calm demeanor hid the strain in his eyes. The psychological weight was crushing. Their marriage, now publicly exposed, had become a symbol of defiance, hope, and controversy, and with each passing moment, they could feel the pressure mounting. The antagonists they had feared, the media, the political powers, even the forces they hadn't fully understood yet, were closing in, and they had no choice but to confront them head-on, not with anger or defensiveness, but with truth. Imran took the microphone first, his voice steady but firm, as he acknowledged the political consequences of their actions and the immense responsibilities they both carried as public figures, but he also spoke of a love that transcended borders and politics, of a shared vision for peace and unity, even in the face of adversity. Priyanka followed, her voice cracking at times with raw emotion as she spoke about the personal cost of being thrust into a global spectacle, how love had become a battlefield, how they had sacrificed their own privacy and security for something they believed was worth fighting for. As they shared their truth, they both realized they were sacrificing something deeper than just their public personas. They were laying bare their vulnerabilities, their deepest fears, and in that moment, the tide began to shift. The defining moment came when Imran, in a moment of pure, uncalculated honesty, revealed that he and Priyanka had always believed in the power of love to heal divides, to break down walls, and that this marriage, despite the global backlash, was a symbol of what could be if people dared to choose understanding over hatred. It was a turning point, not just in the press conference, but in the emotional and psychological landscape of their journey. The weight of the world still pressed upon them, but they had found their voice. The immediate fallout was intense. The media continued to attack, and political figures from both India and Pakistan took to their respective platforms to condemn or defend, but over time, something unexpected happened. The public began to see them not as pawns in a political game, but as individuals, vulnerable and human, struggling to navigate a world that was changing beneath their feet. Their story became a symbol of resilience, of defying expectations, and slowly, the diplomatic storm began to calm. In the months that followed, Priyanka and Imran found themselves not just in the eye of a storm, but in a space where they could redefine who they were, not just as public figures, but as a couple committed to making a difference. They began to use their platform to promote dialogue, peace, and understanding, speaking out about the issues that mattered most to them, bridging gaps between cultures, and fostering conversations that were once too difficult to have. The impact of their actions was far-reaching, and though the road ahead would never be without its challenges, they had changed the course of history in their own small way. They had found strength in each other, in their truth, and in the knowledge that sometimes, the greatest sacrifices are the ones that reveal our most authentic selves. And as the world moved on, they continued to walk this uncertain path, side by side, forever changed by the fire they had walked through, forever committed to each other, to peace, and to a love that had defied the odds. So, if you've enjoyed this wild ride, don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling journeys.